There's nothing quite like the ache of knowing you'll outlive everyone you could ever love. For 600 years, that pain had carved itself deeper into Lord Veyric's heart with each passing decade. He ruled the village of Ravenhollow alone, turning away woman after woman who sought his wealth or power. Then came Elinora, a widowed healer who moved into the old apothecary without asking permission. She was 50 years old, with silver hair and hands that had delivered babies and tended the dying. She looked at him like he was just a man, not a monster. One stormy night, she asked him a simple question that changed everything. But can a creature who has forgotten how to love learn to open his heart again when a rival vampire clan threatens the only woman who ever truly saw him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist never truly lifted from Ravenhollow. It clung to the cobblestone streets like whispered secrets, curling around the ancient stone buildings that had weathered countless storms and witnessed generations pass into memory. In the pre-dawn hours, when most of the village slept behind shuttered windows, Lord Veyric walked these same streets he had walked for 6 centuries. His footsteps made no sound on the worn stones. The heavy boots that had once carried him across battlefields as a mortal knight now moved with the fluid grace of something no longer bound by human limitations. The villagers knew of his nightly walks, though few dared speak of them aloud. They would peek through crack in their curtains and catch glimpses of his tall, lean figure moving like shadow made flesh, his dark hair catching moonlight like spun obsidian. Veyric paused before the baker's shop, where the first loaves were already browning in the ovens. Through the window, he could see Marcus kneading tomorrow's bread, his weathered hands working the dough with the same steady rhythm his father had used, and his father before him. 3 generations of bakers Veyric had watched grow old and die, their children taking over the same shop, following the same patterns. The cycle never changed. Only he remained constant, eternal, watching. He had been 28 when the curse took hold, a knight returning from the Crusades, wounded and dying in a forest glade. The creature that found him there had offered immortality as salvation, and in his delirium he had accepted. What fool wouldn't choose life over death? But the price had revealed itself slowly, like poison seeping through his veins. The thirst for blood was manageable. He had learned to sustain himself on what he needed without killing. The superhuman strength and speed were tools he could control. The loneliness, however, had proven insurmountable. From his castle on the hill overlooking Ravenhollow, Veyric ruled with a distant but fair hand. The villagers paid their taxes, he protected them from bandits and wild beasts, and everyone maintained the careful distance that kept their arrangement functional. He had wealth accumulated over centuries, knowledge gathered from countless books and conversations with the learned men of various eras, and power that could crush any threat to his domain. What he did not have was a single soul who knew his true nature and chose to remain. His castle tower study bore testament to his isolation. Shelves lined every wall from floor to vaulted ceiling, filled with books in a dozen languages, treatises on philosophy, histories of fallen kingdoms, scientific observations from the greatest minds of each century he had witnessed. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface carved with intricate patterns by craftsmen dead 300 years. Here he spent his days reading, writing, and watching the village below through tall windows that offered a view of every rooftop and garden. The windows also showed him every woman who had ever approached his gates. They came in patterns he had learned to recognize. The young ones, seeking adventure and romance, drawn by whispered stories of the mysterious lord who never aged. The ambitious ones seeking his wealth and title, believing they could win his favor through beauty or cunning. The desperate ones, fleeing unhappy marriages or poverty, hoping his protection might offer escape. He had turned them all away. some with kindness, others with stern words, and a few with threats when they proved particularly persistent. None had ever asked what he wanted. None had ever looked past his title and wealth to see the man slowly dying inside his immortal shell. That was before Elinora arrived. She had come on a Tuesday morning when the autumn mist hung particularly thick, driving a wooden cart pulled by a sturdy brown mare that looked as practical and no-nonsense as its owner. Veyric had watched from his study window as she surveyed the abandoned apothecary at the village's edge, a building that had stood empty for nearly a decade since the last healer passed away. The structure sagged like an old man's shoulders. Ivy crawled up its stone walls, and several roof tiles had fallen to create gaps that let in rain and birds. The small garden behind it had gone completely wild, useful herbs choked out by weeds and brambles. Most villagers had given up hope of finding anyone willing to take on such a project. Elinora had climbed down from her cart, dusted off her brown woolen dress, and begun unloading her belongings as if she already owned the place. Veyric found himself studying her with unusual interest. She was perhaps 50 years of age, with silver threading through chestnut hair she wore in a practical braid down her back. Her hands were strong and steady, marked by years of work, and she moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste motion or time. When the P2 of the Ascension, blacksmith approached to warn her about the building's condition, she listened politely, thanked him for his concern, and continued her unpacking. She had brought everything she needed to establish a healing practice. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the cart's canvas cover, filling the air with the scents of lavender, chamomile, and rosemary. Ceramic jars clinked softly as she carried them inside, along with brass scales, grinding bowls, and cloth bags that rustled with seeds and powders. But it was her demeanor that truly captured his attention. She showed no fear, no hesitation, no deference to the mysterious lord whose castle loomed over the village. When children gathered to watch her work, she smiled and answered their questions about her herbs. When the village women approached with cautious curiosity, she introduced herself simply as Elinora, a widow seeking a new home where her skills might be useful. She asked about him exactly once. "The lord of this place," she had said to the blacksmith while organizing her supplies. "Is he the sort who interferes with healers, or can I expect to work in peace?" "Lord Veyric keeps to himself, mostly," the blacksmith had replied carefully. "He's fair in his dealings. Just don't expect to see much of him." "Good," Elinora had said, and that was the end of her curiosity about the master of Ravenhollow. For the first time in decades, someone had dismissed him as irrelevant to their concerns. That first night, Veyric had walked past her building during his usual rounds. Light glowed warmly through the windows she had already cleaned and fitted with new shutters. He caught glimpses of her moving about inside, hanging herbs from the rafters and arranging her jars on newly scrubbed shelves. She had somehow coaxed the old fireplace back to life, and smoke rose cheerfully from the chimney. She was humming as she worked. The sound drifted through the evening air like a half-remembered melody from his mortal youth. When his mother would hum while tending her own garden, he found himself standing longer than usual in the shadows across the narrow street, listening to that warm, human sound that spoke of contentment and purpose. When she emerged to draw water from the well, she glanced in his direction. Most villagers would have bowed or hurried away, but Elinora simply nodded, as if acknowledging a neighbor, before returning to her work. The next morning brought the village's first real test of their new healer. Young Thomas, the cooper's son, had fallen from an apple tree and broken his arm so badly that bone showed white through torn skin. His mother carried him to Elinora's door in tears, begging for help that the village's previous remedies couldn't provide. Veyric had watched from his window as a crowd gathered outside the apothecary. He could smell the boy's blood even from his castle, could hear the mother's sobs carried on the wind. If the healer failed, if the boy died or lost his arm, the villagers would blame the stranger and drive her away. It had happened before with healers who promised more than they could deliver. But Elinora had worked with steady confidence. She cleaned the wound with solutions that made it smoke and bubble, set the bone with splints carved from applewood, and wrapped everything in bandages, soaked with herbs that numbed pain and fought infection. Then she had done something remarkable. She held the boy's good hand and spoke to him gently about being brave, not for others but for himself, about how scars could be marks of survival rather than shame. The boy had stopped crying, his mother had stopped sobbing, and the crowd had begun to murmur about miracles. By evening, Thomas was sitting up and asking for soup. By the end of the week, he was using his splintered arm carefully but without pain. Word spread quickly through Ravenhollow that their new healer possessed skills beyond anything they had known. More importantly for Veyric's growing fascination, she had handled the crisis without seeking his permission, his blessing, or his involvement. She simply saw a need and met it, as if healing were as natural as breathing. Over the following days, he found reasons to extend his nightly walks. The route that had once taken him efficiently through the village now included a longer circuit that happened to pass her building multiple times. He told himself he was simply ensuring the new resident posed no threat to village stability. The truth was more complicated. Elinora represented something he had not encountered in 6 centuries of existence. A woman who seemed genuinely unimpressed by his title, unafraid of his reputation, and utterly focused on her own purpose. She had not once looked toward his castle with calculation or curiosity. She treated his domain as simply the place where she had chosen to work, no different from any other village that might need a healer. It was maddening. It was refreshing. It was dangerous in ways he did not yet understand. On the night that would change everything, when autumn storms lashed the village and sent everyone indoors early, Veyric found himself standing in the rain outside her apothecary. Light glowed through her windows, warm and steady against the chaos of wind and lightning. Inside, he could see her grinding herbs by candlelight, preparing remedies for ailments that would surely follow the storm. She looked up as thunder crashed overhead, and for a moment her eyes met his through the rain-streaked glass. She did not look away. She did not bow her head or pretend she had not seen him. Instead, she set down her mortar and pestle, walked to the door, and opened it. "You're getting soaked standing out there," she said matter-of-factly. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" It was the first time in 600 years that someone had invited Lord Veyric into their home simply because he looked cold and wet. The invitation hung in the storm-lashed air between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Veyric stood frozen in the rain, water streaming from his dark hair and soaking through the wool of his cloak. In 6 centuries, no one had offered him shelter from a storm. No one had looked at him standing wet and bedraggled and seen simply a man who needed warmth. He began, then stopped. What was the proper response to such casual kindness? His social skills, once polished by noble upbringing, had atrophied from disuse. Elinora stepped back from the doorway, leaving it open. "The tea is already brewing. You're welcome to dry off by the fire, though I understand if you prefer your evening walks regardless of weather." She knew about his walks. Of course, she did nothing in a village this size remain secret for long, but she spoke of them without fear or judgment, as if a man walking the streets at midnight were perfectly reasonable behavior. He found himself stepping across her threshold. The interior of the apothecary struck him immediately with its warmth and purposeful organization. Bundles of herbs hung from every rafter, filling the air with earthy scents that reminded him of forests and meadows rather than the mustiness of his castle's ancient stones. Shelves lined the walls, holding ceramic jars labeled in Elinora's neat handwriting. Feverfew, willow bark, comfrey root, dozens of remedies for human ailments he had not needed to consider for centuries. A fire crackled cheerfully in the stone hearth, and a kettle sang softly on its iron hook. 2 cups waited on a small wooden table, as if she had been expecting company. "You were prepared for a visitor," he observed, accepting the rough towel she offered. "I was prepared for anyone seeking shelter from this storm," she corrected, pouring steaming water over herbs in a clay teapot. "Chamomile and honey. It helps with sleep, though I suspect you have different needs in that regard." The comment could have been pointed, accusatory, a fishing expedition for information about his supernatural nature. Instead, it sounded like simple observation, the way she might note that someone had grey hair or walked with a limp. They sat across from each other at the small table, and Veyric marvelled at the strangeness of the moment. The tea was excellent, warming him in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Elinora sipped her own cup and watched the storm through her window with the calm acceptance of someone who had weathered many difficult seasons. "You've made remarkable progress with this place," he said, searching for safe conversation. "The building was nearly derelict when you arrived." "Buildings want to be useful," she replied. "Most problems come from neglect rather than age. A little attention, some basic repairs, and they remember their purpose." Something in her tone suggested she was not speaking only of buildings. They talked quietly as the storm raged outside. She asked no probing questions about his past or his unusual nocturnal habits. Instead, she spoke of her work, her plans for expanding the herb garden come spring, her observations about the village's health needs. She had already identified patterns in the ailments that plagued Ravenhollow's residents: joint pain from the persistent dampness, respiratory troubles from the coal smoke that hung in winter air, recurring fevers that swept through the crowded quarters where the poorer families lived. "Prevention requires as much attention as cure," she explained, refilling his cup without asking if he wanted more. "But people only seek healers when they're already suffering. It's human nature to ignore small problems until they become large ones." Again, Veyric sensed layers of meaning beneath her words. She was a woman who noticed things, patterns, connections, the spaces between what people said and what they meant. It was a quality that had served him well in his mortal life as a military strategist, and he recognized it in her approach to healing. The storm began to fade near midnight, rain gentling from torrential downpour to steady patter. Veyric realized he had spent hours in comfortable conversation with another person for the first time in decades. The novelty was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "I should return to the castle," he said, though every instinct urged him to remain in this warm, herb-scented sanctuary. "Of course." Elinora rose to walk him to the door. "Thank you for the company. Storms always seem less fierce when shared." He paused on her threshold, struck by an impulse he barely understood. "If you have need of anything, supplies, materials for repairs, my steward manages such requests." "That's kind of you to offer." She smiled, and it transformed her whole face, revealing warmth that had been carefully contained during their conversation. "Actually, there is something I might request, though I'm not certain you'll approve." "What is it?" "Nightshade," she said simply. "The purple, flowering variety, not the deadly black. I've used the last of what I brought, and it's essential for treating severe pain. I'm told it grows in the gardens behind your castle, but I understand those grounds are private." Veyric felt something cold settle in his chest. Nightshade. Of course, she would need the one herb that grew only in his personal gardens, the terraced plots he had cultivated for centuries behind the castle's protective walls. No villager had set foot on those grounds in living memory. The gardens were his private domain, where he could walk in daylight when necessary, where he had planted reminders of every place he had travelled in his long existence. They were also where he kept the more dangerous plants, not just nightshade, but wolfsbane, hemlock, and other specimens that could kill an ordinary human with a single leaf. He had never considered that a healer might need access to such things for legitimate purposes. "The gardens are," he began, then stopped. How could he explain that sharing that space felt like inviting her into his very soul? "Forgive me," Elinora said quickly, misreading his hesitation. "I shouldn't have presumed. I can try to cultivate my own plants, though it will take time, and in the meanwhile—" "What do you need the nightshade for?" he interrupted. "Pain that cannot be managed with willow bark or poppy." Her voice took on the crisp professionalism he had heard when she treated the cooper's son. "Birthing pains that threaten both mother and child, injuries where the sufferer might die from agony alone, illnesses that attack the nerves themselves. It's not something I use lightly, but when nothing else will serve." She trailed off, and he realized she was thinking of specific cases, people she had treated or failed to treat for lack of proper medicine. "The children's fever that struck 2 villages over last spring," she continued quietly. 7 little ones died, not from the illness itself, but from the pain that accompanied it. Their parents could only watch while they suffered. If I had possessed nightshade then, properly prepared—" She did not need to finish. Veyric understood the weight of choices made in desperate moments, the burden of lives that might have been saved with different resources. He had carried such regrets for 600 years. "Tomorrow evening," he said, "come to the castle's north gate after sunset. I'll show you the gardens myself." Her face lit with gratitude that made something twist painfully in his chest. "Thank you. This will make an enormous difference for the village." She was thinking of her patients, of future suffering she might prevent. She was not thinking of him at all, and somehow that made her request even more compelling. Here was a woman who asked for his help, not to gain advantage over others, but to serve those others better. As he walked home through the dying storm, Veyric found himself remembering the silver locket hidden in his desk drawer, the one containing a portrait of his mortal love, Elinora, dead these 6 centuries. He had kept it as a reminder of what he had lost, what he could never reclaim. But tonight, for the first time, it felt less like a monument to grief and more like a question about what might still be possible. Elinora had asked for access to his private sanctuary, and he had said yes. Tomorrow she would walk in gardens where no mortal had ever set foot, and he would watch her face as she discovered the botanical treasures he had cultivated in loneliness. The thought filled him with an anticipation that felt dangerously close to hope. The north gate of Veyric's castle had not been opened for a living soul in over 2 centuries. As sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, he found himself standing before the iron-bound oak doors, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the ancient lock. The key turned with a grinding protest that echoed through the evening air like a sigh of awakening. Elinora arrived precisely as the last light faded from the western hills, carrying a woven basket and wearing the same practical brown dress she had worn to treat the cooper's son. She showed no signs of nervousness about entering the legendary lord's private domain, though she did pause to appreciate the intricate metalwork of the gate itself. "Beautiful craftsmanship," she observed, running her fingers along the spiraled iron vines that decorated the heavy panels. 14th century, unless I miss my guess. The smith who made this understood that function and beauty need not be separate things. Veyric blinked in surprise. "You know metalwork? My late husband was a blacksmith." She smiled with the gentle sadness that touched her features whenever she spoke of her past. "I spent 30 years watching him coax beauty from raw iron. You learn to recognize quality when you live with it daily." The revelation added another layer to his understanding of this remarkable woman. A blacksmith's wife would have known hardship, would have understood the dignity of labor, would have learned to see value in things others overlooked. It explained her practical approach to problems and her lack of intimidation by wealth or titles. Beyond the gate, a flagstone path wound through terraced gardens that cascaded down the hillside in carefully planned stages. Veyric had designed the layout himself over decades of patient cultivation, creating microclimates that allowed plants from across the known world to flourish in harmony. Mediterranean herbs thrived alongside alpine flowers, while specimens from his travels to distant lands created exotic displays of color and fragrance. But it was Elinora's reaction that transformed the familiar space into something magical. She moved through his gardens with the reverence of a pilgrim entering a cathedral, stopping frequently to examine plants she recognized and marvel at others she had never seen. Her knowledge was extensive. She could identify most herbs by their leaves alone and understood their medicinal properties with the expertise of someone who had spent decades learning from trial and careful observation. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, kneeling beside a patch of unusual purple flowers. "Is this the Byzantine variant of comfrey? I've only read about it in texts from the old Greek physicians." "I acquired seeds during a journey to Constantinople many years ago," Veyric replied, pleased by her recognition. "It has twice the potency of the common variety, but requires very specific soil conditions to survive in this climate." She looked up at him with undisguised admiration. "How long have you been cultivating this garden?" The question was innocent enough, but it forced him to confront the impossible math of his existence. How could he explain that he had been tending these beds for longer than any mortal lifetime? That some of the oldest plantings were older than her grandparents? "I've always found gardening a peaceful pursuit," he said carefully. "It teaches patience." She seemed to accept this evasion, turning her attention to a climbing vine that produced delicate white flowers. "And this, it smells familiar, but I can't place it. Jasmine, from the mountains of Kashmir. The flowers bloom only at night, and their oil has remarkable properties for treating ailments of the mind, melancholy, nervous disorders, the kind of pain that has no physical source." Elinora straightened slowly, her eyes studying his face with new intensity. "You speak as someone who has experienced such pain." The observation hit closer to truth than she could know. 6 centuries of isolation had indeed taught him about suffering that could not be healed with medicines or time. But her words carried no judgment, only the gentle concern of a healer recognizing symptoms in need of treatment. They moved deeper into the gardens, and Veyric found himself sharing knowledge he had hoarded in solitude for decades. He showed her the nightshade she needed, growing in a protected corner where its purple flowers caught moonlight like scattered jewels. But he also pointed out the wolfsbane that grew nearby, explaining the crucial differences that meant life or death in their preparation. "Never harvest them on the same day," he warned, as she carefully gathered nightshade blossoms in her basket. "Even the smallest contamination between the two could turn medicine into poison." "My husband used to say something similar about his work," she replied, securing the precious flowers with gentle hands. "The difference between a blade and a weapon is often just a matter of intention and precision." As they worked together in comfortable silence, Veyric realized how long it had been since he had shared his knowledge with someone who could truly appreciate it. The gardens had been his private refuge, his way of staying connected to the natural world while remaining hidden from it. Showing them to Elinora felt like revealing the most intimate parts of his soul. "Would you like to see the library?" he found himself asking as they completed their harvest. "I have several texts on advanced herbalism that might interest you. Some are quite rare." Her eyes brightened with the same enthusiasm she had shown for the gardens. "I would be honored." The castle's library occupied the entire 3rd floor of the East Tower, its shelves stretching from floor to vaulted ceiling in a display that represented centuries of careful acquisition. Ancient Roman treatises on medicine sat beside contemporary works on anatomy. Illuminated manuscripts from monastery scriptoriums shared space with texts translated from Arabic scholars. The collection was worth a king's ransom and represented knowledge that existed nowhere else in combination. Elinora moved through the aisles with reverent awe, occasionally pulling a volume to examine its binding or read a particular passage. Her Latin was excellent, her Greek adequate, and she recognized several authors Veyric had assumed were known only to the most learned scholars. "This is Avicenna's complete medical texts," she whispered, handling a leather-bound manuscript with appropriate care. "I thought all copies had been lost during the siege of Baghdad. That one was copied by monks in Toledo before the original was destroyed," Veyric explained, pleased by her recognition. "I acquired it from a Spanish collector who needed gold more than knowledge." They settled at the massive oak table in the library's center, where Veyric had placed an ivory chess set decades earlier. The pieces were carved with exquisite detail, knights with flowing manes, bishops with serene faces, pawns that looked like actual foot soldiers rather than simple markers. "Do you play?" he asked, gesturing toward the board. "My husband taught me," Elinora replied, studying the carved figures. "Though I suspect I'm badly out of practice." As they arranged the pieces for their first game, Veyric felt something shift in the space between them. This was no longer the formal interaction between lord and subject, nor even the careful courtesy between strangers. This was the beginning of something deeper, intellectual companionship, mutual respect, perhaps even friendship. The first game lasted 2 hours, with neither player holding a decisive advantage until Elinora sacrificed her queen in a brilliant gambit that left his king trapped behind his own pieces. "Checkmate," she said quietly, then looked up with a smile that made his breath catch. "I believe I remember how to play after all." The weekly herb-gathering visits became a ritual that structured both their lives in ways neither had anticipated. Every Tuesday evening, as sunset painted the castle walls in shades of gold and crimson, Elinora would arrive at the north gate with her woven basket and quiet smile. Veyric found himself listening for her footsteps throughout the day, organizing his time around their appointed meetings with a precision that would have amused him if he had possessed enough self-awareness to notice. Their conversations during these garden walks grew more personal with each passing week. Elinora spoke of her late husband with the affection of someone who had been truly loved, describing a marriage built on mutual respect and shared purpose. She had helped him in his smithy, learning to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when iron was ready to shape, when heat had penetrated deeply enough to allow transformation without brittleness. "Marriage is like metalwork in many ways," she said one evening as they harvested chamomile flowers by lantern light. "You need patience, proper timing, and the wisdom to know when to apply pressure and when to let things cool naturally." Veyric found himself wondering what it would be like to be shaped by such gentle, patient hands. The thought unsettled him in ways he did not want to examine. In return, he shared carefully edited stories of his travels, describing distant lands and foreign customs, without mentioning the centuries across which these journeys had occurred. He spoke of Byzantine markets, where spices from India mingled with silks from China, of alpine monasteries where monks preserved knowledge through dark ages, of Mediterranean ports, where scholars from 3 continents gathered to exchange ideas. Elinora listened with the fascination of someone who had always dreamed of seeing the wider world, but had been content with the life that kept her rooted in one place. She asked intelligent questions that revealed her understanding of geography, politics, and human nature, making him realize that intelligence was not limited by the scope of one's travels. "You've lived a remarkable life," she observed during their 4th week together, as they selected herbs for her. Expanding inventory. "Most people never venture beyond a day's walk from where they were born. Travel teaches you that people are fundamentally the same everywhere," he replied, which was true even if his method of acquiring such wisdom was impossible to explain. Different customs, different languages, but the same basic hopes and fears. She nodded thoughtfully, then surprised him with a direct question. "Are you lonely here, ruling this place by yourself?" The question hung in the evening air between them like a bridge he was afraid to cross. How could he explain 6 centuries of isolation, of watching generations pass while he remained unchanged? How could he describe the particular agony of immortality without revealing the supernatural truth that made it possible? "Sometimes," he said finally, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had said to anyone in decades. That was the night she invited him to share a meal in her apothecary. "Nothing elaborate," she had said as they finished their garden work. "I've made soup and there's fresh bread from Marcus. It seems foolish for both of us to eat alone when we're already keeping company." The invitation should have been impossible to accept. He could not eat human food without discomfort, could not sit at a mortal table without revealing his true nature through a dozen small inconsistencies. But something in her tone, not pity, not charity, just the practical kindness of someone who disliked waste, made refusal unthinkable. Her kitchen was warm and welcoming, lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on whitewashed walls. The soup was a rich barley stew with vegetables from her garden, seasoned with herbs that filled the small space with homely comfort. She served it in wooden bowls beside thick slices of bread, still warm from the baker's ovens. Veyric managed to consume small portions without betraying his lack of need for sustenance, though he found unexpected pleasure in the ritual of sharing food with someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed. She was an excellent cook, approaching the preparation of meals with the same careful attention she brought to her medicines. "My husband always said I had magic hands in the kitchen," she mentioned, while refilling his bowl despite his protests that he had eaten enough. "Though I think it was simply that I paid attention to what I was doing instead of rushing through tasks to get them finished." "Attention and intention," Veyric agreed. "The difference between mere craft and true skill." They talked late into the evening, and somewhere during those quiet hours, Elinora began working on something that would become precious to both of them. She had noticed him handling kitchen implements with the awkwardness of someone unaccustomed to domestic tasks, and had decided to remedy what she saw as a simple problem. From a piece of applewood she had been saving for special projects, she began carving a wooden spoon with her late husband's tools. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, shaping the wood into curves that would fit comfortably in a cook's grip while maintaining the elegant proportions that made ordinary objects beautiful. "You don't need to," Veyric began when he realized what she was making. "Hush," she interrupted with gentle firmness. "Everyone should have proper tools for their work, whether that work is ruling a kingdom or stirring soup." She worked while they talked, her fingers finding the grain of the wood by touch, coaxing out the spoon's natural shape with small, precise cuts. Watching her hands move in the candlelight, Veyric felt something stir in his chest that he had not experienced in centuries, the simple pleasure of being cared for by someone who expected nothing in return. The spoon took 3 evenings to complete, carved during their conversations over shared meals that became another cherished ritual. When she finally presented it to him, smooth and warm from handling, he found himself unable to speak for several moments. "It's beautiful," he said finally, turning the finished piece over in his hands. "I don't remember the last time someone made something specifically for me. Every person should have at least one thing made by hands that care about them," Elinora replied. But there was a slight flush in her cheeks that suggested the gift meant more to her than simple practicality. That night, as Veyric walked home through the sleeping village, he carried the wooden spoon like a talisman. In his castle tower, surrounded by treasures accumulated over centuries, this simple carved implement felt like the most precious thing he owned. For the first time in 600 years, someone had seen him not as a lord to be feared or courted, not as a mysterious figure to be avoided, but simply as a man who might appreciate having something beautiful to call his own. The realization was terrifying in its implications, and wonderful beyond anything he had allowed himself to hope. Autumn deepened around Ravenhollow, with a beauty that caught Veyric off guard each year, despite having witnessed 6 centuries of seasonal change. The leaves turned to burnished gold and deep crimson, carpeting the village streets with a tapestry that rustled beneath his feet during his nightly walks. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying flowers, that bittersweet fragrance of endings that always stirred something melancholy in his immortal heart. But this year felt different. This year, autumn brought longer evenings to spend in Elinora's company, their conversations extending naturally as darkness came earlier each day. Their chess games had become competitive affairs, with victories trading back and forth between them in patterns that spoke of equally matched minds, learning each other's strategies. "You have a gift for misdirection," Elinora observed one evening as she studied the board where his knight threatened her king. "From an unexpected angle, you make moves that appear defensive until they suddenly become devastating attacks. Centuries of experience teach patience," Veyric replied, then caught himself. Such comments came too easily now, references to time spans no mortal could claim. But Elinora seemed to interpret his words as metaphor rather than literal truth, nodding as if he had spoken of decades rather than centuries. She moved her queen with deliberate precision, creating a fork that threatened both his bishop and his castle. Experience can also make one overly cautious. Sometimes the bold move is the right move, even when it seems dangerous. Her words carried weight beyond their chess game, and they both knew it. Their friendship had reached a point where subtext flowed beneath every conversation, where meaningful looks lasted longer than propriety suggested, where accidental touches of hands reaching for the same piece sent currents of awareness through both of them. The village had begun to notice their association, though gossip remained respectful, given Veyric's position and Elinora's growing reputation as an essential healer. Still, he caught whispered conversations that ceased when he approached, knowing smiles from the baker when he purchased bread that he would share at her table, curious glances from villagers who had never seen their lord spend time with anyone. More unsettling were the moments when other men approached Elinora with offers of companionship. The miller's eldest son had begun finding excuses to visit her apothecary, lingering over simple purchases while complimenting her skills and her appearance. The village's other widower, a prosperous wool merchant, had suggested she might enjoy his company for the harvest festival dancing. Veyric found these interactions triggered responses he had not experienced in centuries, a possessive fury that made his hands clench and his vision narrow to dangerous focus. The rational part of his mind knew he had no claim on her affections, no right to resent other men's interest in a woman who was intelligent, attractive, and unattached. But rationality held little power over the primitive emotions that roared through him when he saw another man making her laugh. "You seem troubled tonight," Elinora commented during one of their evening garden walks, when his distraction had made him silent for longer than usual. They were gathering late-blooming herbs by lantern light, their work creating an intimate circle of warm illumination in the growing darkness. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency among the plants, selecting stems and leaves with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she needed. "I was thinking about the village," he said, which was true in part. "How it has changed since you arrived." She glanced up from the rosemary she was harvesting, her eyes catching the lantern light. "Changed how?" "People seem happier, more hopeful. You've brought something to this place that was missing before." The compliment brought color to her cheeks, and she ducked her head in the way she did when praise made her uncomfortable. "I've simply done what any healer would do. People need care, and I provide it. It's more than that." He set down his own gathering basket and turned to face her fully. "You see the good in people, the potential in situations that others would dismiss as hopeless. It's a rare gift." "And you?" she asked softly, meeting his eyes with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Do you see good in me, or simply usefulness?" The question hung between them like a challenge and an invitation combined. Veyric realized they had moved beyond the careful boundaries of friendship, beyond the safe territory of intellectual companionship. This was the moment when honesty would either deepen their connection or shatter it entirely. "I see a woman who makes me remember what it feels like to be human," he said, the words emerging from some deep place he had thought sealed forever. "I see someone who looks at a broken-down building and imagines the home it could become, who sees a wounded child and thinks only of healing, who sees a lonely man and offers him tea instead of turning away." Elinora's breath caught audibly. "Veyric, I see someone who makes 600 years of solitude feel like preparation for this moment." The truth slipped out before he could stop it. The impossible admission that revealed everything he had been hiding. But instead of fear or rejection, her expression shifted to something that looked remarkably like understanding. 600 years, she repeated quietly, not as a question but as acceptance of a truth she had perhaps suspected all along. "That would explain many things about you, your knowledge of distant places, your collection of ancient texts, the way you sometimes speak as if you've witnessed history rather than simply read about it." He waited for horror, for the revulsion that should have followed such a revelation. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small object that caught the lantern light with a gentle gleam, a violet pressed between thin pieces of glass and set in a simple silver frame. "I picked this in your garden our first night together," she said, holding the preserved flower where he could see it. "I've carried it ever since because it reminded me that even in the longest darkness, beautiful things can bloom." The pressed flower was perfect, its purple petals maintaining their color and shape despite being dried and sealed away from air and light. It was a small miracle of preservation, a moment of beauty captured and made permanent through careful attention. "You knew," he said, understanding flooding through him, "about what I am. I suspected." A woman who has lived 50 years learns to recognize when someone is carrying burdens too heavy for a normal lifetime. She tucked the pressed flower back into her pocket over her heart. "The question is not what you are, Veyric. The question is what you choose to become." In the lantern light, surrounded by the herbs they had gathered together, they stood closer than they ever had before. The space between them hummed with possibility and the weight of choices that would determine both their futures. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping Ravenhollow in a silence that seemed to muffle even thoughts. Snow fell in thick, persistent curtains that transformed the village into something from a child's fairy tale, all soft edges and pristine beauty that disguised the harsh realities of cold and hunger that winter always brought to those without adequate resources. But for Veyric and Elinora, the season's isolation created an intimacy that summer's longer days and autumn's busy harvest had not allowed. With most villagers keeping to their homes after sunset, their evening meetings became longer and more private, conversations that stretched through the night hours, while snow whispered against frost-covered windows. The revelation of his supernatural nature had changed their dynamic in ways both subtle and profound. Elinora's acceptance had been complete and matter-of-fact, as if she had simply confirmed something she had already concluded through careful observation. But that acceptance came with new understanding of the vast gulf between their natures, her mortality against his eternity, her human needs against his vampire existence, her future measured in decades against his endless centuries. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one evening as they sat before her fireplace, their chess game abandoned in favor of more serious conversation. "The choice that changed you?" Veyric considered the question with the weight it deserved. Outside, wind howled through the village streets, but inside, the fire crackled warmly while candles cast dancing shadows on walls lined with her healing herbs. "For 600 years, yes," he said finally. "Every day was a reminder of what I had lost, what I could never reclaim. I thought immortality was a curse that isolated me from everything that made existence meaningful. And now, he looked at her face in the firelight, studying the gentle lines around her eyes that spoke of 50 years of laughter and sorrow, the silver threading through hair that caught the glow like spun moonlight, the hands that had delivered life and eased suffering with equal skill. Now I wonder if perhaps I was simply waiting, preparing for the moment when my existence would have purpose beyond mere survival. The words hung between them with weight that both recognized. They were approaching territory that neither had dared explore fully, the possibility of a future together despite the impossibility of their circumstances. Elinora reached into the wooden box where she kept her most precious possessions and withdrew an object that made his breath catch. It was an iron cross, blackened with age and worn smooth by centuries of handling. The metal was marked with symbols he recognized, blessings from monks who had lived and died before the Crusades, protective wards that had been carved by men who understood the spiritual significance of their work. "This belonged to my late husband's grandfather," she said, holding the cross with reverent care. "A knight who served in the Holy Land, like you did. It was blessed by the monks at Mont Saint-Michel, and it's protected our family through plague, war, and persecution." Veyric stared at the ancient talisman, memories flooding back of similar crosses carried by his brothers in arms, of ceremonies conducted in stone chapels while armies prepared for battles that would reshape the world. The cross in Elinora's hands was contemporary to his mortal life, created by craftsmen who might have known his name. "You should keep it in your family," he said, though his voice was rough with emotion. "I have no family left to inherit it," she replied simply, "and I think it belongs with someone who understands its true value, someone who has carried similar burdens and fought similar battles, even if those battles were against different enemies." She placed the cross in his hands, and he felt the weight of consecrated iron against his palm. By all accounts, touching blessed metal should have burned him, should have caused agony that no supernatural creature could endure. Instead, he felt only warmth, as if the cross recognized something in him that transcended his vampiric nature. "Elinora, you are not the monster you believe yourself to be," she interrupted, covering his hands with hers so that they both held the cross together. "Monsters do not spend centuries learning to heal rather than harm. Monsters do not collect knowledge to preserve it for future generations. Monsters do not carve wooden spoons for lonely women or share gardens filled with beauty." Her words broke something inside him that had been carefully protected for 6 centuries. In the firelight, with her hands warm against his and the blessed cross resting between their palms, Veyric felt the last of his defenses crumble away. "I love you," he said, the confession torn from him like a physical wound. "I love you, and it terrifies me because I know what happens to mortals who become entangled in supernatural lives. I know how these stories end." "Do you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears that glistened in her eyes. "Because I think this story is different from any that has been told before." She leaned forward then, closing the distance between them with the same decisive grace she brought to all her actions. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, 2 souls discovering that the connection they had built through words and shared silences could translate into physical intimacy that felt both sacred and transformative. When they separated, Veyric found himself trembling, not with hunger or supernatural need, but with purely human emotion he had thought buried forever. "I'm mortal," Elinora said, her forehead resting against his. "I will age and die while you remain unchanged. But right now, in this moment, we have something precious. The question is whether you have the courage to cherish it instead of mourning what cannot be changed." Snow continued to fall outside her windows, blanketing the world in pristine silence. Inside, by the warmth of her fire, They held each other with the desperate tenderness of lovers who understood that time was both their enemy and their greatest teacher. The blessed cross lay between them, no longer a barrier between mortal and supernatural, but a bridge connecting two souls who had found in each other something worth more than safety, more than certainty, more than the careful protection of hearts that had been wounded too many times. For the first time in 6 centuries, Veyric allowed himself to believe that love might be stronger than the curses that had shaped his existence, that redemption might be possible even for creatures who had wandered too long in darkness. In Elinora's arms, holding the cross that had blessed knights and protected families, he felt something he had thought lost forever. Hope for a future that included not just survival, but joy. The ancient vampire summoning horn arrived on the night of the winter solstice, carried by a messenger who vanished into shadow before Veyric could question him. The horn itself was carved from bone that had yellowed with centuries of age, its surface inscribed with symbols that predated written language. Even without touching it, he could feel the power radiating from the artifact, a summons that no vampire could ignore, backed by authority that transcended individual will. He stood alone in his tower study, the horn resting on his desk like a serpent coiled to strike. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains that muffled all sound, creating the illusion that Ravenhollow existed in a world apart from time and consequence. But the horn's presence shattered that illusion, dragging his carefully constructed piece back into the supernatural realm he had tried so desperately to escape. The message was simple, carved into the bone, in characters that shifted and moved when he looked at them directly. Return to face judgment or face extinction. He knew the hand that had carved those words. Malthios, his sire, the elder vampire who had made him 6 centuries ago during those desperate moments in the forest glade. Malthios, who had disappeared from his life as suddenly as he had entered it, leaving behind only the curse of immortality and a warning that debts would eventually come due. The memories flooded back with painful clarity. His mortal death from wounds that should have healed, the creature that emerged from shadow to offer salvation at a price he could not comprehend, the agony of transformation that remade his body into something no longer entirely human. But what followed had been worse than the physical changes, the hunger, the isolation, the growing realization that immortality was not a gift, but a sentence to watch everything he loved wither and die. When Malthios had finally revealed himself again decades after Veyric's transformation, it was to extend an invitation to join a court of vampires who reveled in their supernatural nature. They hunted humans for sport, accumulated power through fear and manipulation, and viewed mortals as resources to be exploited rather than people deserving of respect. Veyric had refused. The refusal had cost him everything. He had not known, during those early decades of his vampire existence, that his rejection of the court's lifestyle was considered rebellion. He had not understood that choosing to live in isolation, feeding only when necessary and protecting rather than predating upon humans, was seen as a betrayal of his fundamental nature. The punishment had been exile, banishment from supernatural society, forbidden from seeking the companionship of his own kind, condemned to endure immortality alone. For 6 centuries, he had believed his isolation was self-imposed, a choice made to protect others from his dangerous nature. The truth was darker and more complex. He was a criminal in the eyes of vampire law, and his sentence was solitude that would last until he either submitted to their authority or chose to end his existence entirely. Now Malthios was calling in the debt. The horn's presence meant the period of exile was over, and judgment would be rendered whether Veyric appeared voluntarily or not. The sound of footsteps on the castle's stone stairs interrupted his dark thoughts. Only one person had access to his private tower. Only one person would climb those steps with such confident purpose. Elinora appeared in the doorway, her cloak still dusted with snow and her cheeks flushed from the winter cold. I saw strange lights from the village, she said, then stopped as her eyes fell on the bone horn. Her expression shifted, recognizing the artifact's malevolent power, even without understanding its specific purpose. What is that thing? A summons, Veyric said, his voice hollow with the weight of impending loss. From my past, from the one who made me what I am. She moved into the study, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. The vampire who transformed you? Maltheos, my sire, as our kind call such relationships. I thought he had forgotten about me, that my exile would be permanent. I was wrong. Elinora approached the desk, studying the horn with the same analytical attention she brought to diagnosing illnesses. What does he want? Submission. Acknowledgement that I owe him obedience for the gift of immortality. He wants me to join his court, to embrace the predatory nature I've spent centuries trying to deny. And if you refuse? Veyric met her eyes, seeing his own despair reflected in her steady gaze. Death, not just for me, but for anyone the court considers complicit in my rebellion. They view attachment to mortals as the ultimate betrayal of vampire nature. The implications hung between them like a blade poised to fall. Their love, which had seemed like redemption, had become the weapon that would destroy them both. By caring for her, by allowing himself to hope for a future that included human companionship, he had marked Elinora for execution. "How long do we have?" she asked, and he marveled at her composure. Another woman might have fled, might have raged against the unfairness of supernatural politics invading mortal life. Elinora simply sought the information she needed to make informed decisions. The horn's arrival means they're already gathering. A few days, perhaps a week before they reveal themselves openly. She nodded thoughtfully, then moved to the window overlooking the village. "There's something I haven't told you. About myself. Something that might change our situation considerably." Veyric felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter cold. "What do you mean?" "My healing abilities. They're not entirely natural." She turned from the window to face him, her expression steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "My family line carries what some would call witchcraft, though we've always preferred to think of it as a deeper understanding of the natural world's hidden properties." The confession hit him like a physical blow. A witch. His mortal love had witch blood, which explained her exceptional healing abilities, her intuitive understanding of herbs and their properties, her complete lack of fear when confronted with his supernatural nature. "You knew what I was from the beginning," he said, understanding flooding through him. "I suspected. My grandmother could sense supernatural presences, and she taught me to recognize the signs. Your lack of aging, your knowledge of things that should be beyond any mortal lifetime, the way animals react to you. It all pointed to something beyond normal human existence." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to trust me enough to reveal it yourself. Because I needed to know that you saw me as more than just another mortal to be protected or pitied." She moved closer, her eyes holding his with fierce intensity. "And because I wanted to be certain of my own feelings before I complicated our situation with family secrets." The revelation recontextualized everything about their relationship. Her acceptance of his nature, her lack of fear, her ability to see past his monstrous aspects to the man beneath all of it, made sense now. She was not just a mortal woman who had somehow fallen in love with a vampire. She was something far more dangerous in the eyes of supernatural law, a witch who had chosen to ally herself with a rebel. "This makes everything worse," Veyric said, though part of him felt relief at finally understanding the depth of her courage. The court views witches as either servants to be enslaved or threats to be eliminated. There is no middle ground in their philosophy. "Perhaps not," Elinora agreed. "But there are laws even vampires must follow, ancient compacts that govern interactions between our kinds. My grandmother's grimoire contains references to such agreements, treaties signed in blood during the early days when supernatural beings were learning to coexist." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a leather-bound book that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The grimoire was ancient, its pages filled with knowledge accumulated over generations of wise women who had walked the line between human and supernatural worlds. "There may be options we haven't considered yet," she said, opening the book to pages covered with symbols that made the air itself seem to shimmer. "Old laws that haven't been invoked for centuries, but which still carry weight in vampire courts." As she began to read from passages that described alliances between vampires and witches, Veyric felt something stir in his chest that he had thought permanently extinguished hope. Perhaps their story did not have to end in death and separation. Perhaps love, combined with ancient knowledge, might prove stronger than the supernatural forces arrayed against them. But first, they would have to survive the coming confrontation with powers that had shaped the hidden world for millennia. The grimoire lay open between them on the ancient oak desk, its pages glowing with soft phosphorescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. Elinora's fingers traced the elaborate script as she translated passages that had been written in a mixture of Latin, ancient Celtic, and symbols that predated both languages by centuries. "Here," she said, pointing to a section illustrated with intricate drawings of vampires and witches standing together beneath a full moon. "The Covenant of Balanced Souls, signed during the reign of Charlemagne, when supernatural beings were establishing territories across Europe. It grants certain protections to bonded pairs who represent alliance between vampire and witch bloodlines." Veyric leaned closer, studying the text with growing amazement. "I remember hearing whispers of such agreements during my early years as a vampire, but I assumed they were legend. Most vampires consider them obsolete. Obsolete, perhaps, but not invalid. Laws written in blood magic and sealed with ancient oaths don't simply fade away because they've been forgotten. They remain binding on all who fall under their jurisdiction." She turned several pages, revealing a section that made his breath catch. The illustration showed a formal trial, with vampires and witches serving together as judges, while bonded pairs stood before them, seeking protection under the Covenant's terms. "The right of Heart's champion," Elinora read, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "When a vampire faces judgment for crimes against the court, a bonded witch may invoke this right and stand trial alongside their chosen mate. If both survive the trials, they are granted sanctuary and recognition as a legitimate alliance." "Elinora, no." Veyric straightened, understanding immediately what she was suggesting. "You don't comprehend what vampire trials involve. They're designed to destroy the participants, not vindicate them. Malthios and his court won't honor ancient laws if they can find ways to circumvent them. But they cannot simply ignore them either." She closed the grimoire and met his eyes with the calm determination he had seen when she treated the most difficult cases. "My grandmother told me stories of such trials. The vampire courts may be cruel and predatory, but they're also bound by traditions that preserve their authority. They cannot rule arbitrarily without undermining the very foundation of supernatural law." Outside the tower windows, the night seemed unnaturally dark. No stars showed through the cloud cover, and even the moon remained hidden behind veils of mist that had nothing to do with natural weather. The supernatural forces gathering around Ravenhollow were already affecting the local environment, bending reality to accommodate powers that existed beyond mortal understanding. "Tell me about the trials," Elinora said, moving to look out at the village below. "What exactly would we face?" Veyric joined her at the window, watching lights flicker in cottage windows where families prepared for sleep, unaware that ancient forces were converging on their peaceful community. 3 challenges, traditionally. First, a test of strength and loyalty, usually combat against other vampires, to prove worthiness. Second, a trial of wisdom. where the accused must demonstrate knowledge of vampire lore and history. Third, a test of will, where the bond between vampire and witch is subjected to magical assault designed to break their connection. And if we survive all three, then we would be granted sanctuary under the covenant, recognized as a legitimate bonded pair with rights under supernatural law. But Elinora, the mortality rate for these trials is irrelevant, she interrupted with gentle firmness, because the alternative is certain death for both of us. At least this gives us a chance to fight for our future together. A sound drifted through the night that made them both freeze, the low, mournful call of a hunting horn echoing from the forests beyond the village. It was answered by similar calls from different directions, creating a circle of sound that seemed to tighten around Ravenhollow like a noose. "They're here," Veyric said unnecessarily. Throughout the night, supernatural presences gathered in the darkness beyond the village boundaries. Ancient vampires who had walked the earth for millennia, each carrying power that could reshape reality through will alone. Veyric could sense their individual signatures, feel the weight of their collective attention, focusing on the small community that had become the center of their judgment. But more surprisingly, other powers were stirring as well. The grimoire had revealed that Elinora was not the only witch descendant in the region. Her arrival in Ravenhollow had awakened bloodlines that had remained dormant for generations, calling them to witness what might be the first invocation of the ancient covenant in over 2 centuries. "My family is not the only one with supernatural heritage in these lands," Elinora explained as they prepared for what might be their final night together. "There are others, scattered across the countryside, who carry the blood of wise women and cunning folk. The trials will call them as witnesses, whether they wish to come or not." Dawn brought an unnatural stillness to the village. Mist hung heavy in the streets, despite the absence of wind, and even the usual sounds of morning activity seemed muted and distant. Villagers went about their daily routines with the nervous energy of people who sensed change approaching but could not identify its source. Veyric spent the morning hours in preparation that felt both practical and ritualistic. He donned clothing that had belonged to his mortal knighthood, a simple tunic of undyed wool, leather breeches worn soft with age, and boots that had carried him across battlefields 6 centuries past. Over it all, he fastened the blessed cross that Elinora had given him, its iron weight resting against his heart like armor forged from faith rather than metal. Elinora made her own preparations with the same methodical care she brought to complex healing procedures. She braided her hair with ribbons that her grandmother had blessed, wove protective charms into the fabric of her dress, and filled small pouches with herbs that held power beyond their medicinal properties. The villagers began to notice the changes as the day wore on. Shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position, animals refused to venture beyond their shelters, and sensitive individuals reported dreams filled with ancient voices speaking in languages they did not recognize. By evening, even the most skeptical residents understood that something momentous was approaching their community. "You should evacuate the village," Veyric told Marcus the baker when he came to deliver what might be their last shared meal. "Take your family to your sister's farm beyond the eastern hills. Stay there until this is finished." "Lord Veyric," Marcus replied, with the respectful firmness of someone who had served the castle for 30 years, "we know something dangerous is coming. We also know you've protected this village since before any of us were born. If you're making a stand here, then this is where we belong." Similar conversations occurred throughout Ravenhollow as word spread that their lord faced some form of supernatural judgment. Instead of fleeing, the villagers began quiet preparations to defend the community that had sheltered them for generations. The blacksmith sharpened every blade in his shop, the baker prepared bread that would feed defenders through a siege, and even the children helped gather stones that might serve as weapons if more conventional arms failed. They could not understand the supernatural forces gathering around them, but they understood loyalty and gratitude. As sunset approached, Veyric and Elinora stood together in the castle's highest tower, watching the mist that concealed their enemy's approach. The ancient stone circle beyond the village boundaries had become visible despite the fog, its megalithic pillars glowing with pale light that hurt mortal eyes to observe directly. "Are you certain about this?" Veyric asked, taking her hand in his. "Once we invoke the covenant, there will be no retreat, no opportunity to reconsider. We will face whatever judgment the courts render together." Elinora squeezed his fingers, her touch warm and steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. 600 years ago, you chose immortality to survive. Tonight, we choose to face whatever comes together." The hunting horns sounded again, closer now, their voices weaving together in harmonies that spoke of power older than written history. As the last light faded from the western sky, supernatural courts that had not convened for centuries prepared to render judgment on love that dared to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal worlds. In the distance, the ancient stone circle blazed with cold fire as beings of terrible beauty and predatory grace took their places around its perimeter. The trial that would determine their fate was about to begin. The ancient stone circle blazed with supernatural fire as dawn approached, each megalithic pillar crowned with flames that cast no heat but illuminated the gathering with light that seemed to penetrate soul as well as flesh. Within the circle, figures of terrible beauty arranged themselves in positions of judgment. Vampires whose immortal existence stretched back to the dawn of civilization, their pale faces marked by centuries of accumulated power and predatory wisdom. Malthios stood at the circle's heart, unchanged from the creature who had transformed Veyric 6 centuries ago. His appearance remained that of a man in his prime, dark hair untouched by time, and eyes that held depths no mortal mind could fathom. He wore robes of midnight blue, embroidered with silver threads that moved like living things, and in his hands he carried the Covenant Blade, an ancient ceremonial sword whose steel had tasted the blood of countless trials. "Veyric of Ravenhollow," Malthios called, his voice carrying across the distance between village and stone circle with supernatural clarity. "You stand accused of rebellion against your nature, of denying the gifts bestowed upon you through transformation, and of consorting with mortals in defiance of vampire law. Present yourself for judgment." Veyric and Elinora walked hand in hand through the village streets, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence that had settled over Ravenhollow. Behind them, the villagers watched from windows and doorways, their faces reflecting fear and determination in equal measure. These simple people might not understand the supernatural forces at work, but they recognized courage when they saw it. As they approached the stone circle, Veyric felt the weight of 6 centuries pressing down upon him, every choice made in isolation, every moment of loneliness endured, every decision to protect rather than prey upon the humans whose world he had tried to serve. This trial would determine whether those choices had meaning or whether he had simply delayed an inevitable reckoning. "I present myself as accused," Veyric replied, his voice carrying clearly in the charged air. "But I am not alone." Elinora stepped forward, and even in the supernatural assembly, her courage commanded attention. She wore her finest dress, deep green wool, embroidered with protective symbols her grandmother had taught her to weave. The grimoire hung at her side in a leather satchel, its presence marking her as more than simply a mortal companion. "I am Elinora Whitethorn, daughter of the Whitethorn line, keeper of the old knowledge and practitioner of the healing arts," she announced with formal precision. "I invoke the ancient right of Heart's champion under the covenant of balanced souls and demand to stand trial alongside my chosen bondmate." The reaction among the vampire court was immediate and intense. Several of the assembled judges exchanged glances that spoke of recognition and concern. The covenant of balanced souls had not been invoked for over 2 centuries, and many had assumed its provisions were safely buried in forgotten history. Malthios's expression shifted from confident authority to something approaching uncertainty. "The covenant you cite is obsolete, mortal woman. The modern age has no place for such ancient compacts. Laws written in blood and sealed with power do not become obsolete through disuse." Elinora replied, opening her grimoire to the relevant passage. "They remain binding upon all supernatural beings who fall under their jurisdiction. I claim sanctuary under Article 7 of the Covenant, which grants protection to bonded pairs who represent alliance between vampire and witch bloodlines." A new voice spoke from the shadows, beyond the circle, ancient, female, carrying authority that made even Malthios pause. "The mortal speaks truth. I am Seraphina Blackmore, keeper of supernatural law, and I have come to ensure proper application of covenant provisions." The figure that emerged from the darkness was clearly a vampire of immense age and power, but she wore the formal robes of a judicial arbiter rather than the finery of court nobility. Her presence changed the entire dynamic of the gathering, introducing an element of legal precedent that Malthios had not anticipated. "Very well," Malthios said after a moment's consideration, though his tone carried dangerous undertones. "If the accused wishes to invoke ancient law, then ancient law will be applied in its fullest measure. 3 trials await you: strength, wisdom, and will. Should either participant fail any trial, both will face execution. Do you still wish to proceed?" Veyric and Elinora exchanged a look that contained 6 months of growing love, shared dreams, and mutual determination. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but fierce resolve. In his, she found the courage that had sustained him through centuries of isolation. "We proceed," they said in unison, their voices creating harmony that resonated through the stone circle with unexpected power. "Seraphina." Blackmore stepped forward, raising her hands to begin the formal invocation. "Let the trials commence under the covenant of balanced souls. First trial, strength and loyalty, to be determined through combat. The accused will face champions of the court in tests designed to prove their worthiness, to claim covenant protection." Malthios smiled with predatory satisfaction as he drew the covenant blade, its steel singing as it cleared its ancient scabbard. "I will serve as first champion. Let us see if 6 centuries of denying your nature has left you capable of defending what you claim to cherish." The blade blazed with supernatural fire as he assumed a fighting stance that spoke of millennia of combat. Experience. Around the circle, the assembled court leaned forward with anticipation, eager to witness a confrontation that would determine not just individual fate, but the future relationship between vampire and witch bloodlines. The covenant blade sang through the air with supernatural speed, its ancient steel leaving trails of cold fire as Malthios pressed his attack. Veyric barely managed to deflect the strike with his own weapon, a knight's sword he had carried in his mortal life, blessed by the same monks who had consecrated Elinora's iron cross. The clash of supernatural forces meeting blessed steel created sparks that illuminated the stone circle with harsh, brilliant light. 6 centuries of playing protector to mortals has made you weak. Malthios sneered as he circled his opponent. "You fight like a human still, bound by mortal limitations you should have discarded long ago." But Veyric's combat style was not weakness, it was choice. Where Malthios relied on inhuman speed and supernatural strength, Veyric fought with the disciplined precision of a knight trained to protect rather than simply destroy. Every parry served to shield rather than simply counter, every movement calculated to defend not just himself, but the woman who stood within. The circle's protective bounds. The assembled vampire court watched with growing amazement as the battle continued far longer than any had anticipated. Malthios possessed superior power, but Veyric's defensive mastery and tactical intelligence turned every advantage into a contest of skill rather than mere force. "Enough games," Malthios snarled, raising the Covenant blade high above his head. Supernatural energy gathered around the weapon, transforming it into an instrument of pure destruction that could cleave through stone as easily as flesh. "Face your nature, or die as a failure." The blade descended with killing force, but instead of trying to block or dodge, Veyric did something unexpected. He dropped his guard entirely and spoke a single word in the ancient language of his knighthood: mercy. The Covenant blade stopped mere inches from his throat, held immobile by forces that had nothing to do with physical strength. Around the circle, witnesses gasped as they recognized what had occurred. By invoking mercy rather than seeking victory, Veyric had triggered one of the Covenant's most obscure provisions, the right of clemency that allowed trial by combat to end without death, when honor was preserved by both participants. "Impossible," Malthios breathed, struggling against the supernatural force that prevented him from completing his strike. "You cannot invoke clemency while under judgment for rebellion." "He can, if his rebellion was itself an act of mercy," Seraphina Blackmore observed, stepping forward to examine the frozen tableau. "The Covenant recognizes that strength may be demonstrated through restraint as well as violence. By choosing protection over predation for 6 centuries, the accused has already proven his strength lies in service rather than domination." The invisible force holding the blade gradually released its grip, allowing Malthios to lower his weapon with obvious reluctance. The first trial was complete, and to everyone's surprise, both participants had survived. "Second trial," Seraphina announced, producing a scroll covered with text that seemed to write itself as she spoke. "Wisdom and knowledge of supernatural law. The bonded pair will demonstrate their understanding of the Covenant's provisions and their ability to uphold its requirements." This trial proved to be a formal examination that tested not just knowledge of vampire law, but understanding of the delicate balance between supernatural and mortal worlds. Questions came from all assembled judges, covering everything from ancient territorial agreements to modern diplomatic protocols that governed interaction between different supernatural species. Veyric's centuries of study served him well, but it was Elinora's practical wisdom that provided the crucial insights. When asked about resolving conflicts between vampire courts and witch covens, she spoke not of dominance or submission, but of mutual benefit and shared responsibility for protecting the hidden world from exposure to hostile mortal authorities. The Covenant exists not to establish hierarchy, but to create partnership, she concluded her final answer. Vampires and witches possess complementary abilities. Your immortal perspective and accumulated knowledge balanced by our connection to growing, changing life. Together, we are stronger than either bloodline alone. The judges conferred in whispered conversations that carried undertones of power and ancient authority. Finally, Seraphina nodded with what might have been approval. "The second trial is satisfied. Your knowledge is adequate, but more importantly, your understanding serves the Covenant's true purpose." She paused, studying both participants with eyes that held centuries of accumulated wisdom. "The third trial will test the strength of your bond itself." As she spoke, the air within the stone circle began to shimmer with energies that attacked the mind rather than the body. Psychic forces, designed to probe for weakness, to exploit doubt and fear, to drive wedges between souls that dared to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal existence. The assault was immediate and devastating. Veyric found his mind flooded with memories of every moment of loneliness he had endured, every instance when his vampire nature had isolated him from human connection. Beside him, Elinora gasped as her own fears manifested images of aging and death, of being abandoned when her mortality became inconvenient, of discovering that his love was merely fascination with something he could never truly possess. But at the moment, when the psychic attack reached its peak intensity, something unexpected occurred. From Elinora's satchel, a soft light began to glow, not from the grimoire, but from a small object she had crafted during their months of growing closeness. A simple band of meteoric iron, forged in her late husband's smithy, using techniques passed down through generations, blessed with words of binding that had nothing to do with supernatural compulsion and everything to do with freely chosen commitment. The ring pulsed with warm light that pushed back against the psychic assault, creating a sanctuary of shared strength that no external force could penetrate. 1 year later, Ravenhollow had transformed into something unprecedented in the supernatural world. A sanctuary where the ancient barriers between mortal and immortal existence had dissolved into something beautiful and sustainable. The village that had once hidden in fearful respect of its mysterious lord now thrived as a beacon of cooperation between human and supernatural communities. The wedding ceremony took place on the anniversary of their trial, conducted in the same stone circle where they had faced judgment and emerged victorious. But this gathering bore no resemblance to the terrifying assembly of vampire courts that had once threatened their destruction. Instead, representatives from dozens of supernatural bloodlines came to witness something that many had thought impossible, a formal union between vampire and witch that carried the full weight of ancient lore and modern hope. Elinora wore a gown of midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver threads that caught moonlight like captured stars. The meteoric iron ring rested on her finger, its simple band transformed by the Covenant's blessing into a symbol recognized by supernatural law as binding beyond mortal death. Veyric stood beside her in the formal attire of his knighthood, the blessed cross visible at his throat, and his expression radiating a peace that 6 centuries of existence had never previously allowed. Seraphina Blackmore officiated the ceremony, her ancient voice weaving together vows that acknowledged both the temporary nature of mortal life and the eternal commitment that transcended physical existence. When the ritual concluded and the bonded pair sealed their union with a kiss that blazed with supernatural light, even the most cynical witnesses found themselves moved by the profound love that radiated from the couple. But the true transformation extended far beyond a single ceremony. In the months following their trial, word had spread throughout the hidden supernatural world about the sanctuary that existed in Ravenhollow. Other vampires who had grown weary of endless isolation began arriving, seeking the possibility of connection with mortals who could accept their nature. Witches whose bloodlines had remained dormant for generations awakened to their heritage and sought training in the old arts. Elinora's apothecary had expanded into a proper healing center where supernatural abilities enhanced traditional medicine to create treatments more effective than anything the region had previously known. Her extended lifespan, a gift granted by their bonding ritual, meant she could accumulate knowledge and experience without the limiting factor of human mortality, while her retained humanity kept her connected to the needs of ordinary people. The village council now included both mortal and supernatural representatives, creating governance that protected all residents regardless of their nature. Trade agreements with distant communities brought prosperity that was shared equitably among all who contributed to Ravenhollow's success. Children grew up learning that differences in heritage were simply variations to be celebrated rather than feared, creating a generation that would carry forward the lessons of tolerance and cooperation. Veyric himself had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. No longer the isolated lord ruling through distant authority, he had become a true protector and guide, whose centuries of accumulated wisdom served the community's collective benefit. His library open to any serious scholar, regardless of their mortal or supernatural nature, creating an unprecedented center of learning that attracted visitors from across the known world. But the changes ran deeper than mere policy or social structure. The very atmosphere of Ravenhollow had shifted, charged with the kind of hope that transforms how people see their own possibilities. Marriages between mortal and supernatural partners were no longer forbidden anomalies, but recognized unions that strengthened the community's unique character. Children born from such partnerships inherited the best aspects of both heritages, becoming living bridges between worlds that had been artificially separated for too long. The memorial stone that commemorated their union stood in the village center, carved with words that had become Ravenhollow's unofficial motto: "Love transcends nature, courage conquers fear, and wisdom builds bridges where walls once stood." Visitors often paused to read the inscription and learn the story of how two souls from different worlds had risked everything to prove that love could indeed conquer the plight. Seemingly insurmountable. On quiet evenings, when the day's responsibilities were complete and the village settled into peaceful rest, Veyric and Elinora could often be found in their private garden, a space that combined the formal elegance of his castle grounds with the practical beauty of her herb plots. They would sit together on a simple wooden bench he had crafted with his own hands, sometimes talking about their plans for the community's future, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence of two people who had found their perfect complement. "Do you ever regret it?" Elinora asked one such evening, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Giving up the solitude that protected you for so long?" Veyric considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved, thinking about the years of careful isolation that had once seemed like his only path to safety. Then he looked around at the village that had become more home than his castle ever was, at the people who sought his guidance without fear, at the woman whose presence had transformed every aspect of his existence. "I spent 6 centuries believing that love was a luxury I could never afford," he said finally, pressing a gentle kiss to her silver-streaked hair. "But you taught me that love isn't something we possess. It's something we become when we stop trying to protect ourselves from the possibility of loss." In the distance, the ancient stone circle stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, its megalithic pillars no longer symbols of judgment, but monuments to the power of courage freely chosen. The covenant that had saved them continued to protect other bonded pairs who sought sanctuary from supernatural persecution, but more importantly, it had proven that ancient laws could evolve to serve justice rather than simply tradition. As they sat together in the garden where their love had first taken root, Veyric and Elinora understood that they had achieved something rarer than immortality or magical power. They had found a way to make eternity meaningful through service to something greater than themselves. Their story would be told for generations as proof that love, when combined with courage and wisdom, could indeed triumph over any force that sought to divide hearts meant to beat as one.